Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're catching this episode. And hopefully you're following me on LinkedIn and Instagram and all of the places. You can find me at HR Traci. That's HRTRACI. So before I get into this week's episode, I'm going to go back for a moment because I had a very kind listener who reached out on Instagram via DM. And she said that actually she's in the process of applying to PhD programs in the hopes of studying management and organizations through an athletic lens. So Sid, thank you so much. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but thank you so much for reaching out. Sid actually recorded a bunch of voice notes that help us, at least they helped me, to better understand some of the nuances behind college athletes and the NCAA and this whole kind of moment in time and legislation, or not even legislation, but lawsuit, I should say, that's kind of coming up. So I have her permission to play the voice notes. And so I'm going to play them and take a listen, and you'll hear a really strong, I would say, explanation for some of the things that we talked about a couple weeks ago. So here we go.
So a big issue, or there's a couple of issues surrounding student athletes and their status as employees. First and foremost, early on when it was established, the key wording that was used in any legislation or any documents surrounding student athletes was that phrase exactly, student athlete, which allowed institutions and the NCAA to categorize athletes as students first, meaning whenever they would get a scholarship to cover their tuition or to cover their room and board, that was essentially the same as if a student who was a music savant got a scholarship to cover to go to the school, or if someone who was really smart and got an academic scholarship, that would be categorized at the same level. The issue with that, however, is student athletes often aren't
Here we go. Next one.
allowed to participate in extracurricular activities. So whereas me being on an academic scholarship would allow me to also work full time, a student athlete is dedicated their time to staying in class, but also being able to go to practices and attend games, which won't allow them to have regular full-time or part-time jobs to help cover them through. It also made it illegal for coaches or institutions to provide any type of financial relief for them. So in the past, it would be as bad as saying if a coach bought a student a meal, that could be classified as illegal. The issue that was posed up to this is that the NCAA became a governing body that could impose laws on institutions, even though it was completely separate from the American legislation system and from colleges as a whole. So it became essentially its own form of a governing body, which is what brought up the lawsuit originally. What most people don't understand in their misconceptions would be that the universities themselves are the ones who are receiving the money directly from athletic programs and or putting the money back into it. A lot of institutions have separated their funds. So, for example, I graduated from LSU. It is a prominent school for sports and for academics. LSU has something called the Tiger Athletic Fund. So any money that comes in and out for sports is funneled through the Tiger Athletic Fund, whereas LSU as an institution gets their funding from alumni and then from the states as well. So the imposition for student athletes when it's male versus female or popularity sports is that football and basketball could be revenue generating, whereas gymnastics or tennis may not be revenue generating. So if all athletes are classified the same, then that would mean that student athletes who play football could make it further than student athletes who play tennis, even if they were doing it's a very convoluted and interesting topic that I could talk about for hours. And I, as I mentioned, have a strong interest in the intersection between the workplace and athletics, especially at the collegiate level. So if you ever have any questions or if you want to chat more about it, I'm very interested and would love to keep the conversation going. And one thing I forgot to add was that previously, student athletes could not make money off of their name, image, and likeness. So any jersey sales or anything with their face on it, it was illegal from the NCAA for them to make any money from that. And that was struck down about a year and a half ago. So student athletes were able to now receive money for it. So that was a beneficial all around, because if I am a football player, I have the potential to make the same amount of money as someone who is a gymnast or a volleyball player, because the money would come from local investors, so local businesses who want to use their name and image and likeness versus having the schools directly pay them. So it was a fair way for student athletes to make money that they previously did not have access to, which was very beneficial in growing their game and also compensating them fairly.
So thank you to Sid for sending those voice notes in, because it definitely helped me to better understand where all of this sits and why it's coming up now and what existed before. So some of the things that when she originally sent this to me a couple weeks ago, some of the notes that I took down just to kind of recap what she shared is that the key word really here is student athletes, that they were categorized as students first and often weren't allowed to participate in extracurricular activities, that the NCAA was a governing body that could impose laws and regulations, that schools receive money directly and or have separate funds. And she referenced the LSU Tiger Fund, with the example that football and basketball can generate revenue, but potentially other sports may not. And that previously student athletes couldn't make money on their name and likeness, and that was struck down. So really interesting stuff. It really helped me. Thank you again, Sid. It really helped me to understand all of this. And it definitely validates this feeling, I think, for me, that it sounds like these college athletes are employees. So thank you to Sid, and hopefully that helped clarify things for all of you as well. So this week, I want to talk about a recent publication. You might hear me clicking around in the background here because I want to pull it up. But there was a publication made by the APA, which stands for the American Psychological Association, and they published a psychological safety in the changing workplace report for Work in America 2024. And it's really interesting. There are a lot of takeaways, and I want to talk about this because while I think we do talk about psychological safety on the podcast, I think a report like this, especially from the APA, which is a research or like a body for psychologists, it's an association. So they do a lot of research, they make a lot of publications. I think it's just interesting to see some of the highlights from this report. And I'll link the report so you can download it if you're interested. I know that there are some folks out there who listen who are interested in organizational psychology and things like that. So this could be interesting on a few levels for you. So first things first, when we think about psychological safety, it's really important that we understand what it is. Psychological safety is really basically like the existence of safeness and safety, where employees can feel safe specifically to express themselves and take risks without fear of reprisal or negative consequences. And, of course, environments that have more psychological safety tend to be environments where people feel happier or more connected, maybe retention is better, and then environments that don't have as great of a level of psychological safety potentially see the opposite, and maybe they have a lot of turnover. Maybe people define the environment as toxic, and so psychological safety does have a very deep impact on environments and how people would classify their work experiences as well. The report itself found that psychological safety is associated with higher job satisfaction. So 95% of those with high psychological safety report being satisfied with their jobs, compared to 85% of those with low psychological safety. 95% is super high. I mean, that's, when you think about like where job satisfaction can come in and what having a high job satisfaction means on a company, like for those of us who are in HR, we can think about this from two lenses: A, as an employee, and B, as a proxy for an employer or like this middle person. And driving psychological safety and improved psychological safety has a direct correlation, as we see in this report. And of course, the leadership and leaders foster these environments, and there is a direct impact on the ability for people to feel creative and innovative, to take risks, to fail, all of those things, to make mistakes. Like, all of those things are hugely impactful on an environment, because if a company needs to progress in order to stay competitive, you have to have an environment where people are willing to take risks and unafraid to make mistakes. And if you don't have that, your progress will probably be stifled. These are just essentially my opinions, but the report does kind of emphasize this. And something I wanted to share, which was interesting, is that highlight in this report brings up tensions that come about from intergenerational employees, and I should say a workforce. So I've had guests on before who have talked about some of the intricacies of having a workforce that is multi-generational. And, there are sometimes tensions that come with that. Remote work, 4-day work weeks, AI, economic concerns, all of these things are trending circumstances or macro and micro situations and effects that do impact the workforce and psychological safety. Interestingly enough, it says in the report that younger Americans are more comfortable with working with others their own age, and that there are currently up to 5 generations in the American workplace today, which can significantly impact the ability for someone to feel like they can or are comfortable working with folks in other generations. And when asked, here, U.S. workers aged 18 to 25 are significantly more likely than workers aged 44 to 65 to agree they feel more comfortable working with people their own age. So there's literally more than half of people in that 18 to 25-year-old group feel more comfortable working with people their own age. And there's a quote here which I thought was really interesting. And it's from a 26-year-old Hispanic female office worker. And she says, even though I've been working at my firm for 4 years, it's a short span compared with someone else at the same workplace. But just because I don't have years of experience doesn't mean that what I say isn't a good idea too. So you can hear in that last sentence that this is not just a multi-generational tension. This is a reflection of psychological safety. It sounds to me, at least, it doesn't say this in the report, but it sounds to me that this 26-year-old experienced some negative interactions at the hands of someone that is in a different generation of her, or from her, but where we see that there is maybe an absence of psychological safety for this person, because someone who feels psychological safety probably wouldn't say, it doesn't, just because I don't have years of experience doesn't mean that what I say isn't a good idea too. It sounds like this person's been shot down. It sounds like this person's ideas are not welcome. And so when we understand that, we can understand better the impact that psychological safety has, especially when we look through this lens of multi-generational workforces. To kind of continue, of course, I think we probably understand that there is an impact on employee well-being too when it comes to psychological safety. There is, of course, this deep connection, and employees, as the report says, employees with higher psychological safety are less likely to experience stress or emotional exhaustion. In fact, only 17% reported feeling emotionally exhausted compared to 34% of those with lower psychological safety. That's like a double in terms of points there. I mean, when those who have psychological safety in the workforce are saying that less than a quarter are emotionally exhausted, whereas those who have lower psychological safety in the workforce, more than a third, are saying that they are feeling emotionally exhausted. And with a lack of psychological safety, this, of course, can lead to burnout and a higher rate of turnover. 19% of those with high psychological safety considered leaving their job, compared to 41% of those with low psychological safety. So this is more than 30 points, really, difference. So when we if we're looking at this from the HR perspective, and we're, maybe your company or your organization is having challenges with turnover, it sounds based on this report that there is such a direct correlation between turnover and low psychological safety, and in the same breath, retention and high psychological safety. Of course, I think when we break this down in terms of our own experiences, like I don't think that we would want to really stay with an organization where we don't feel heard, where we don't feel like we can express ourselves, where we don't feel like we can make mistakes, because then you're always walking on eggshells, and that's not so fabulous. And by the way, I didn't mention this report surveyed more than 2,000 employed adults in the United States. So this is, a pretty strong sample size. Obviously, it's not a significant percentage of employed adults in the US, but we do have, people who have been surveyed across all industries and ages and experiences. So when we think about our roles, obviously as HR people, there has to be a strategy in place where we can build psychological safety. I think, at least if you ask me, I think that psychological safety is an underpinning for all of these other initiatives that we may have. If we have a goal of improving DE&I, there has to be psychological safety in place. If we have a goal of improving retention, psychological safety has to be high. If we have a goal of succession planning and talent development and learning and development and career growth, there has to be high psychological safety. So I would go on a limb, go on record to say that focusing on psychological safety could be a great strategy for improving all of these other things, or at least making it so that when you have all of these other initiatives, you can actually work to achieve those initiatives and drive those initiatives in an effective and consistent way. Because I can only imagine that if there isn't high psychological safety in an organization, that all of those other initiatives probably don't really have great adoption, and they probably are not super effective. So let's think about like some strategies here for building psychological safety. We, of course, need to think about leadership, because while everyone builds a culture and contributes to a culture, leaders, and really when we understand like a top-down effect here, have a direct impact on whether or not there is high psychological safety in an organization. So we have to provide those leaders actionable steps to ensure that they're creating a psychologically safe environment. Things like open communication, active listening, the yes and strategy. So if you might be familiar with the strategy where if someone offers an idea, rather than maybe saying but or shooting it down or telling them why it doesn't work, you can say yes and you can even ask them to elaborate or talk about how they would execute on this idea and how they would see this idea through. That obviously offers the opportunity for continued communication and conversation, and for this person to continue to ideate, which is good. We want people to think. We want them to feel like they can contribute, and to actually contribute, not just feel like it, but actually do it. And then, of course, providing constructive feedback. Feedback is really important, but the emphasis here is on constructive. We want to make sure that feedback is given in a way that allows the person to reflect and maybe even adjust their approach to whatever it is that they're getting feedback on. I would also really encourage you use the APA's report. These findings where we see that employees who experience higher psychological safety have better relationships with coworkers, for example. This is a 99% satisfaction, and managers have a 97% satisfaction. So these things, like these statistics and understanding the connection between higher psychological safety and better relationships, better retention, better or less burnout and less emotional exhaustion, like all of these things can help you get the buy-in from leadership. And then, of course, with psychological safety, offering feedback opportunities, supporting caregivers and parents in the workforce, and of course, also respecting personal boundaries. These are also all things that are really specific when it comes to generating high psychological safety. If you put yourself in someone's shoes, or even maybe in your own shoes where you've experienced this, I can give you my example. I have a calendar hold, or I have a hold on my calendar for 5:30 until 7 every Monday through Friday. And the idea there is that it says family time, please ask before scheduling. And I do that because that's my personal boundary. I'm not willing to miss bedtime for my daughters. And so in that, I'm saying this is my boundary. If there's some urgent need to meet, talk to me first, or let's meet after 7. I'm willing to do that. I'm not willing to sacrifice the bedtime routine with my kids. And so those personal boundaries, when people respect those boundaries, which thankfully there is a lot of respect for my boundaries at my job, that is a direct correlation to feeling the psychological safety is high in that organization. And then, of course, when we think about these strategies, we have to measure their success, and we have to be able to maintain psychological safety in the workforce. So, of course, when you think about your roles in an organization, there has to be a discussion around the methods for assessing psychological safety, whether you use surveys or you close feedback loops, maybe you pilot different initiatives with certain parts of the organization. All of these things are methods for measuring the success, which is really important. It's the same reason why measuring diversity metrics or measuring compensation metrics, all of those things help to better understand where an organization is achieving or maybe needs to improve. And then, of course, companies should explore the positive outcomes that come with maintaining psychological safety. So, for example, the report says that there's a higher self-rated performance and productivity, and that 91% of workers with high psychological safety rated their performance as very good or outstanding, compared to 69% of those with lower psychological safety. I think this makes total sense. And actually, another thing I'm thinking about here too is that some organizations on the whole might have high psychological safety, but there could be pockets within an organization or pockets within departments or departments themselves that have lower psychological safety, where we can then make an impact or have an impact on improving those results. And then finally, we talk about empathy a lot on the podcast, but encouraging empathy, encouraging diversity, equity, and inclusion, inclusion training, all of these things directly contribute to sustaining and maintaining psychological safety. And the report does a really nice job of highlighting all of these things as well. And there's so many statistics in this report. Like, I'm looking through it now to see if I missed anything. But at the end of the day, like, when we think about what has retained us in our careers and our companies, we have to be able to translate that and relate it back to the other employees. And hopefully, more often than not, companies are driving higher psychological safety. But it definitely, I think this is where, some people might say, well, why does HR own that? It's less about that and more about how we can influence a better outcome and influence a better experience for people in the workplace, employees, managers, etc. So hopefully this was helpful for you, and maybe you feel inspired to read through the report and drive or influence some change or some celebration in your workforce. If you survey your organization and you see that psychological safety is a win, you should really celebrate that, because that is, again, in my opinion, the underpinning for all of these things and all of the initiatives that we in HR or in other parts of the business we may want to drive. And with psychological safety, with higher psychological safety, we're able to do those things more efficiently and more effectively. So thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully that was helpful. Like I said, take a look at the show notes for the report. You can download it. It's totally free. There are highlights that you can read through. Maybe you don't want to read through the whole report. I get it. It's long, sort of, but I think it's really helpful information. But you could take a closer look in that way. And let me know what you think of this episode and if that helped you at all. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your week. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. I will see you next week for another episode. Bye. Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.